everyone for the bootcamp for the 14 SP4 release. My name is Marina. I'm a product owner for Tridion Docs, and I would like to share what achievements we have for the 14 SP4 release in terms of different aspects, usability, functionality-wise, and many things we actually focused for the whole year. So in terms of the agenda, as I mentioned, I would like to focus on collective spaces, obviously, for the draft space and review space, what kind of functionality improvement we had, and what kind of usability improvement we provide as well for different manipulation with the content. So it can be editing content, creating something in the content, how to review the content, and so on. And we have some improvements for client tools and in terms of platform support, what we are supporting basically currently. So if I would like to talk about collective spaces, we have Walker 14 SP4 release. This is the name we chose. And basically, let me focus on collective spaces overall, and I will go more into certain details, difference, what we do for draft space, for the review space, and so on. So a good practical thing is to have terminology updates. It's for better consistency, so everyone would be on the same page. And we call component for both topics and maps. And topics and maps refer still the exact type of the components. So I think it's not something like drastic changes, but it's just in terms of if we are talking to each other on the same, using the same language and the same terminology. And let's go to more practical things. That means usability. And from that perspective, we decided to add more languages for collective spaces for both draft and review. You can see as a user Spanish, French, and Italian languages, and it's very practical when you, as a user, editing content or creating the content, so you have more user-friendly usability, so that would be more convenient for the user. So since we speak, not every one of us, we don't speak language as a native language, so it's critical to have more user-friendly options. And looking more deeper in terms of what we've done for not only usability, I would like to focus on how we are actually creating the content. So we introduced the spell checker functionality. So the spell checker is basically the function or option that you can see across different applications. It becomes as default settings. If you do anything editing in the Word or in social media, anywhere, you have a lot of suggestions or highlighting things that were spelled not in the correct way. So it's important that we also have this functionality out of the box in our product. And some maybe important things I would like to mention, that spell checker is available for draft space only. That means for creating the content. It's critical to know that it respects lazy loading. That means it's checking only the loaded components. And there are certain things that it's worth to mention as well. It's not spell checker is not available for checking for the read-only content. That means it can be different attributes like conref and so on. And also it is possible we are actually using We are using spell checker as a dictionary. For that is an external party. We are using third-party dictionary. So basically, we are providing what we have regarding the suggestions for spelling. And maybe the last important notes in terms of overall what is spell checking is doing. It's possible to actually replace words and ignore words to configure the ignoring list. A little bit more details about spell checker. As I mentioned, read-only content on all maps elements except titles. Skipping spell checkers will be, and for the hidden content, it's not applicable. A little bit, maybe less detailed about the spell checker is by default, we exclude certain elements that no need to be checked, and it gives more control also to a user, that the user can customize that list of spelling. Something more in terms of creating the content, it's about the ability to create equations. So for those who are dealing with the more technical content, when equations can be placed and there is a need to have them there, we provide the ability to create the equation, the ability how to, it's possible right now how to edit equation, and for that we actually focus on certain UI implementations and changes. It doesn't come out of the box, the editing MathML or equations, for instance, and also we don't host the instance of the virus. So the clients need to take care of it themselves. And also, since I mentioned we improved the usabilities for how to actually create and editing equations. So certain UI improvements can be seen on this slide in terms of snippets, basically from the screens. I think this is pretty much about how to create the content. So I would like to go to the aspect how we actually can add, not only edit, but review the content. So what kind of usability improvements we have. So for the draft space, we introduce the option to collapse and expand topics basically in one click. It's very important for users who are dealing with the very big publications with a lot of topics, and the navigation can be done sometimes not easy browsing through it. So that functionality to collapse and expand on all components in one click is for those users, and basically it's possible to collapse and extend it all of them, or do it in different levels, depends on the nest of the publication. So something more about how to review the content. So it is possible to provide a status for a component, which is a topic, in order to easy to review it, and that status actually we introduce it as a badge. It can be actually very helpful in terms of how to filter out that content in the outline very quickly and review it. So for instance, it is possible to select the status of the badges from the drop-down menu, or do it by the keywords. So it would be actually very helpful in this regard. For the users, status can be easily configurable in the in content management system, and users can add as many statuses as they want for their convenience. So we don't provide any limitations in that regard. And in addition to that, there is a next and previous button in the review space in the outline that also helps to focus on components, what needs to be reviewed as well. So here there are some more details how to actually provide those settings and give certain statuses to the pages in this on this slide, and a little bit more about components, how to focus. It's basically the functionality for statuses based on the user roles. And maybe a little bit more, I didn't mention about next and previous buttons. So there are some limitations. Even if I set up a filter for pages in order to review my publication, those next and previous buttons wouldn't respect the filter and will go to the next component, which is topic. Other usability improvements. So for the draft space, it is possible right now to select multiple cells at once. And if a user is dealing with the situation to create quite massive and big tables, those tables would be collapsed for the size 10 and 10 cells. So it's very user-friendly and quite easy to actually deal with the content that has a lot of different tables and so on. Something more about not only usability improvements, but maybe how easy to use certain fields for the metadata. So for them, before we didn't have the option that basically if a user needs to use optional fields, that was a need to actually make optional field available and edit certain fields. But since optional fields has a lot of, it's a long list of fields to have certain manipulations. So sometimes it's not convenient in terms of if you do any changes and you don't remember where you were before. So now it's possible just to stay where you are while you're actually editing optional fields in the metadata form. In terms of helpful things for users, since editing content also it's not about creating the content itself, it's also about working with the comments and suggestions and so on. It could be a few people involved into creating the content. So we introduced the accept changes for suggestions. So what is important to know about that? It's available for draft space only, since it's about how to create the content and add comments to create the content. And certain not limitations, but despite of the function options that we provide that for the replacement of the comments in very easy way, it is still possible to disable it. And in that regard, if a user doesn't want to have a suggestion, it is still possible copy and paste content to keep it clear and not have any unfortunate cases when it was when a user is just missing the content with applying suggestions. In terms of usability, if I look on the screen as a user, for instance, myself or any other users, there are so many ways that can be done with the different shortcuts. And it's really hard to remember those hotkeys by heart. So what we decided to do, just to have a very small button in the corner of the screen where there is a hint or basically suggestion of all shortcuts that can be done by a user. So there is no need to remember all those combinations by heart. Little bit more about usability in terms of how we see images. So sometimes image can be a part of the text and should be inlined, or sometimes we need to highlight an image since it's an important content, maybe it has a lot of details. So for the moment, with the current release, users can have actually options. They can or select inline image and placement in line, and they use it for some content that which is more appropriate, or it can be actually a figure as an image with the break, and the picture would be actually very visible in the document view. Something like quick maybe mentioning about line breaks in the custom block. It's for performing text respecting line breaks for those who needed that. We also support inserting objects and DraftSpace, and we improved certain things for usability, and it's possible to do it in a more logical way right now. A little bit about usability in terms of read-only content, which is actually the review space. So if we look on the previous release, we have certain in the review space, the content was a bit blurry and not very sharp, and that was very difficult for users to focus. Right now, we have better rendering background, better size of the font, and everything is more pleasant for your eyes, basically. So that issue that we had before, we solved it. A little bit about, in terms of usabilities, how we actually rendered the footnotes when it comes position it in the table. So you can see basically what was before, and changes that we have done for rendering footnotes in a better way in terms of block layout. So something a little bit about review, not little bit, but let's focus, since we talked a lot about improvements in DraftSpace. So what is done for review space in terms of improvement for 14 SP4 release? I talked before about tables, that it's possible to actually collapse it in the draft space, but especially when we are dealing with very massive tables, but that option was not available in the review space. And now it's the same logic for tables in the review space as in the draft space. So basically, it's possible to expand, collapse the table, and it would be rendered in a very nice way in review space, so the user will be able to see it. In terms of how we looked and on the hazard nodes in the review space, before we have different colors, like background colors for nodes and hazard statements, but without any indication which one it belongs to what. And for instance, since it's just colors for the end users, it was difficult to have to distinguish it, which stands for what. And we decided to render it in a better way. I will show it in the demo later on. Document history. I think it's very important to think about how the document history solving many problems and issues overall. So it is possible to track different changes in documents within one version. That means different revisions. It is possible to understand what changes were implemented and this functionality is quite critical in terms of see the improvements or changes of the content, instead of just remembering by heart or thinking about what was done before. This functionality is helping to actually see it right away. So for the draft space, and same applies for review space, clients, they need to purchase license for that. And in terms of how to go to the document history, we spent some time and decided to provide certain improvements in usability, maybe some sort of like a shortcut in a way. So before we had only option to go to the document history from outline in a draft space, but it's more maybe easier to do that at the same time while you're working creating the content. So here you can see show changes button. Those are changes we've done for the UI improvements in the review space. It is still possible to open the document history using shortcut hotkeys. And same actually changes applies to review space. So in the review space, it was not possible to open document history before in that way. And we also introduced the same changes in the UI. Same way, basically same behavior, so same pattern for users. They are not going to see any difference working in the draft space and review space in terms of how to open document history. And same shortkeys applies to that. If we are talking about creating the content, conditions are a very important part of that, because we are creating the content that allows to use to have different versions, and conditions are those instruments that content can be actually provided in the final output the way that is suitable for the company's needs. So conditions in the collective spaces, both draft and review space, is a quite powerful instrument. And in terms of rendering, we decided to improve it, since it's a lot of background colors coming. So for conditions improvements for the cascade menu, you can see that we introduced here the arrow, so it's more understandable. So it's still a cascade menu. Improvements of conditions in terms of rendering in the steps. Basically, it's very visible what was happening before and what is now, and also how we render conditions for footnotes also. When it comes to tables, we also improved the rendering for fixing styles for the tables with the conditions. So basically, it's more user-friendly now, less background colors in the document view, and more structured in that regard. And since we are talking about conditions in the draft space with the background colors, how to see what happens in the review space when conditions apply to the content, if it's actually, or it's false conditions or it's a correct conditions. So what happens in the review space in that regard? So basically, we hide all false conditions in the review space, and we show true conditions without any background color. So in the review space, you will have less those color things, comparing what can be seen in the draft space. And we also skip all false conditions in the review space. Okay. So in terms of, let's see what we have basically in terms of improvements. So we have how to create the content, as I talked about that. So for that one, we have a spell checker that helps us to check the spelling of document. So you can see suggestions, and you actually can configure the ignore list, replacement for the words misspelling and so on. That can be seen in detailed documentation for that. So I think it's quite visible how to use it. It's quite easy to do that, enable and disable it. And as I mentioned, it works for draft space only and for read-only content. Sorry, it's not working for the read-only content. In terms of creating the content, we have for those who are dealing with the technical aspects, creating equations and so on. So basically, it is quickly possible to create an equation, for instance, here easily. Mm-hmm. Something more complex. And sometimes there are cases that the equations cannot be rendered, and it is still possible to edit it. So this would be edited. If we talk more about the visualization, improvements in terms of usability. So we have, in terms of how to insert the image, for instance, as I mentioned. So this is a case when the image is a figure with the break, and this is the inline image. So for those who are dealing with different content and how to create it in a better way. So in terms of if we are talking not only about how to create the content, we have outline where the users can actually work on looking at the document structure in this regard. And basically, as I mentioned, it is possible to filter out the content, how to review it. For instance, this is the review space. And I would like, for instance, as a user to focus on certain components, so I can add them in statuses, which are badges in our cases. And I can actually add a change in the status over here. I have only those statuses too, which is draft and to review and release, 3 of them actually. But and I can add those statuses to the topic. So if you look at the review space, if I need, I can easily set a filter for those focus components, for instance, with the statuses, or I can use keywords if I had more statuses, so very similar to each other for the shortcut in a way. And since I have statuses for different components, I can go to the next and previous components using the next and previous buttons easily. So navigation is done like this way over here. In terms of not creating, but reviewing the content. So we actually work on improvements of how conditions can be rendered. So for cases like cascade of conditions, we have, this is a good example. So basically we introduced this arrow, so that would be part of the cascade of the conditions. And for working with conditions for more complex ways, which is setting conditions on the tables, for instance. This is how the conditions will be rendered on the tables in the draft space. If I want to compare rendering conditions in the draft and review space, especially in case for the false conditions, for instance. Here you can see conditions on the node types. As a curiosity or just basically supporting my presentation, I can have a look what we have in review space and how we render false conditions or all conditions, true conditions or false conditions. So here, as an example, in the menu cascade, we have a false condition on the element, and in the review space, it would be excluded. Basically, the reason behind that is the content supposed to be looked how it should be in review space, how it should be looking in the final output. So since it's a false condition in the draft space, it would be excluded in the review space in order not to confuse the user. Same applies for instance, node types, same logic. This node type is excluded for the publication in the draft space, and in review space, it will be not even visible. And if you see, even the number is changing. So here is number 1 with the false condition for the footnote, and it respects the number. So instead of 2, it's going to be number 1 in order to have a consistency. In terms of conditions in the outline, so I think we can see it over here. So I have a false condition on the whole component, which is a topic. So this is the example how we actually have in the mouse over message, and some feedback for the user or kind of guidance. So it's excluded, and also some message will be helping. And what happens in the outline? In the outline, we have false conditions strike through. And if I want to have this topic as a child to the topic, the previous one, which would be parent for me, if I move it right, it becomes also a component with the false condition, and it will be indicated in the document view the same way as a parent and in the outline itself. And what happens with this component, what happens in the outline for this publication regarding conditions? Same thing that I have seen over here. Let's see what is happening in review space. So in review space, we don't see the component with the false condition, which is a touch screen with the title. Here we don't see it at all. And since I didn't save the document here, draft space, when I did manipulation for the component to make it as a child for a parent, let's refresh it and see. So it's also disappearing. It disappears from the outline, a topic with the false condition, and in the document view. So basically the same way as it would be shown in the final output. Little bit, let's talk about in terms of improvements, usability. This is the hazard notes and statements, how it's rendered in the draft space. And since I mentioned that we spend time on improvements for the hazard notes, so those notes and statements can be seen in the review space this way. So there is a title of each, so it will be less confusing to a user. And if I want to see a very big table, relatively big this one, in the review space before, with the more massive tables, it was not possible to render it in the proper way. So now it is possible to expand it and collapse it, same way as it works in draft space. Basically, compress it. Okay, so let me quickly check what I would like to mention in addition, what we discussed in the what changes we had for draft and review space. So this is again one of the example of how we rendered false conditions in the draft space in a better way, and for the equation as well. Okay, let me go back to the put to the presentation, and let's talk what else, what kind of changes we also have. User, what basically you see what is in the document topic and how we resolve it in the outline. And let's maybe talk about cases when we have keyref in the publication and how we render it also in the document. So basically, what happens with the keyref? Some clients still using that, and basically to render the idea to how we are trying to render the keyrefs, it's not an easy way, but basically, generally speaking, for variables and text and images, variables are the most usable contractable way. So sometimes even some customers use keyref, and in the document title or in the content put keyrefs on certain elements like images or just content itself. We actually showed that how we rendered. I will quickly demonstrate it in the demo. But this cannot be customized. So basically, the strong recommendation for resolving cases when a text or a content has a keyref is basically use variables for that, and that would be more appropriate in this regard, and it would be cases when those issues would be actually not there anymore with the keyref. And this is a snippet from screenshot from a document where you can see that we actually added the over message for a user that this part contains the keyref. And a little bit what we have. Know that this is basically more or less for how to render the keyref. Little bit improvements for how to deal with the support for certain tasks. For instance, we have machinery tasks and learning assignments. So for those, we edited usability with more easy way tasks, or easy way steps, basically for users. So those are the cases. What schema now updated. We had issues with the machinery tasks. Topic were failed to load in the publication. So this what was happening before in the schema, and now we updated it. It allows any order of these elements in machinery tasks. So you can see the case before and after. And this is some sort of a guidance in terms of maybe highlighting usability, what we've done, and I'm gonna go to some sort of snippets. It's a clear guidance for users in terms of steps, where to go, how to navigate, and selecting steps, so it's more easy for everyone these days. Same done for machine learning domain. That before it's more appropriate actually to talk about those who are using learning and training content. So before we didn't have that improved usability in terms of steps, where to go and how to do that, and now we have more clear guidance in the bar with the steps, and basically how the learn content was not displayed, but we actually added in the interaction menu, and that helps to insert all types of learning questions and so on. Some information about that. Statuses to focus we have over here of the component in order to review it in an easy way. So it is possible to add as many statuses as you want as a user. And in terms of how to do that, it can be done in the content manager. So for instance, I land here, I need to go to the settings, and we have settings XML collective spaces for those, and we have draft space settings, and we have review settings. So for those, we have status to focus here for the draft space, and the same thing applies to review space, status to focus. So status is to be reviewed over here. So as I can add as many statuses as I want for better review and basically save it. So going back a little bit for how the certain attributes can be rendered. This is the example of the rendering keyref. So it is possible still see that it's an image on what keyref was set, but you cannot see the image itself since we don't resolve it. But this is the message to user that we have for that regard. Okay, so let me go back to the presentation. Somehow change it a bit. Go back to the presentation. So client tools. So what we've done for client tools, we sorry, technical issues. So in terms of support, we are supporting Oxygen from the version 23 and higher. Basically, this is the important thing that we would like to indicate. For the publication manager, what improvements we had done. So fixing certain issues for the baseline, and it's a better way to use a compare view in the publication manager. Some changes for the content importer. So basically, it's for the version. It's versions are used now updating an object to import. So before we had the case with the version 1 and 1 and latest. So we resolved that one, and maps imported without explicitly specified version numbers use the replaced version regardless of whether the latest version is released. And this is the example of how to update the latest version in the metadata file and how to create a new version. For content importer, some quick update. It's for adding support for version detail 1.3. Attributes to convert it into ref attributes converted into each condition, and pretty much that's it. I somehow, for some reason, I don't know, didn't cover the case when we have a custom sidebar in the slides in the presentation, and it can be seen in the documentation. So the idea behind that, it is possible to add more custom sidebar with the configuration, and it can be actually added custom sidebars. It's possible for a user editing custom sidebars in the draft space, as many as a user wants, and for review space it applies the same. So that's an important thing. For some technical reasons, maybe I skipped it in the slides, but I think it's worth to mention. So this is pretty much everything that we've done for Worker SP4 release. There are certain technical aspects that can be seen in documentation, for instance, regarding document history, how to enable, disable document history. It requires configurations. And how to set up more custom sidebars. It's also possible to do it, and we have a detailed explanation in the documentation for that. I will suggest to check it. If you have any concerns or questions, so reach out to us for additional assistance. So pretty much this is what I would like to highlight in terms of draft and review space, what we've done, and what we did for usability improvements, how to review the content, how to edit the content, how to actually render better attributes or conditions or anything like that in the draft space, and how to hide those elements like conditions, invalid conditions, or anything that should not be in the final output. So I think it's very important for users to know and to see. And in this regard, that would be more easy to create the content, to work with the content, to edit the content, and to have more benefits using collective spaces, both draft and review space. So in this regard, maybe we thank you for attending the session, and I think we can close the session.